On my graduation day, I called my dad. He laughed. A golf trip sounded more fun. My name is Nora Vance. I am 27 years old. I am standing in the gravel overflow lot behind Alaska Airlines Field at Husky Stadium with my black gown zipped halfway at my back and my phone pressed so hard against my ear that I can feel my pulse in my jaw, watching 2,000 other families find each other in the crowd while mine does not answer. It is 9:52 on a Saturday morning in the second week of June, the kind of pale Seattle morning where the light hasn't decided yet if it's going to rain, and I am the only person in this lot standing completely still. Everyone else is moving, hugging, adjusting sashes, holding up phones. I am watching the call connect on the third ring, and I already know, in the part of my chest that has known this exact thing for 27 years, exactly what I'm about to hear. My father picks up on the fourth ring. There is wind on his end of the line. Not city wind. Fairway wind.
Nora.
Hey, kiddo. A pause, and behind it, unmistakable, the metallic ping of a driver connecting with a ball. What's up, Dad? Where are you? Chambers Bay. Mitchell got us a tea time. We're on the back nine. Another pause, shorter this time, and I can hear him doing the math a half-second too late. Wait, was that today? I did not say anything for exactly 1 second. Long enough to hear my brother's laugh carry across the line behind him, easy and unbothered. The laugh of a man who has never once in his life had to wonder if anyone was coming. A golf trip sounded more fun, my father said. He wasn't even apologizing. He was explaining, the way you'd explain to a coworker why you'd skipped a meeting that didn't matter. I want to tell you how I got to that gravel lot, alone, in a gown that cost $40 to rent and represented for years of a life my family had decided, a long time ago, wasn't worth showing up for. Because it didn't start this morning. It started 9 years earlier, at a kitchen table in Bellevue, on a Tuesday night in October, when I was 18 years old, and I told my parents I wanted to go to law school. My father had laughed then, too. I grew up the middle child in a house that only had room for one kind of success, and my brother Mitchell got there first, not because he worked harder, but because he was louder, and in my family, loud got fed first. Mitchell played baseball through high school, decent but not scholarship decent, and when that ended he drifted into selling commercial insurance, which paid fine and required nothing of him that resembled discipline. My father, Richard Vance, had spent 31 years running the parts counter and then the whole floor at a regional truck dealership in Renton, and he measured a person's worth almost entirely by two things: whether you could talk to a room and whether you played golf with him on Saturdays. I could do neither. I read at the dinner table, asked questions that made people uncomfortable. I was, by the family's unspoken vocabulary, intense, which was the word my mother used instead of the word she actually meant. My mother, Diane, was never cruel to my face. She was the kind of dismissive that doesn't leave marks, the kind that shows up as a raised eyebrow when I said I wanted to double major, as a "that's nice, honey" delivered in the same tone she used for the weather, as the way she'd introduce me at church picnics as our other one before pivoting immediately to whatever Mitchell had going on that quarter. She never told me I couldn't do something. She simply never asked what I was doing, which I learned eventually is a much more efficient way to say it. By the time I was 16, I had stopped bringing home report cards. Not because they were bad. Because nobody looked at them anyway, and it had started to feel like performing for an empty room. The dinner table was where it calcified. Sunday dinners at my parents' house followed the same choreography for years. Mitchell would talk, usually about a client he'd landed or a fantasy football trade, and my father would lean back in his chair with the specific posture of a man who has found his favorite show, and my mother would nod along and add small supportive sounds, and at some point, always at some point, someone would ask me what I was up to, and I would answer, and the table would go quiet for exactly as long as courtesy required before turning back to Mitchell. I counted it once, the year I was 22, home for winter break from undergrad. 14 times in 6 weeks, my mother introduced me to a neighbor, a cousin, a family friend, without once mentioning what I was studying. She'd say my name. She'd say I was still in school. She would not say the words political science, or the words pre-law, or the words Dean's List, which I had made 4 semesters running. I did not correct her. I reached for the rolls instead. That was the shape of it for years. Not a single dramatic betrayal, but a slow, patient erasure, one Sunday dinner at a time, until I had gotten so good at absorbing it that I almost stopped noticing I was doing it. Mitchell was never cruel about it either, and that was, in its own way, worse. He wasn't the kind of brother who mocked me outright. He just existed in the family's foreground so completely that I learned to think of myself as background furniture by default. When he closed a big account at the insurance agency, $63,500 in annual premiums from a mid-sized logistics company in Kent, my father brought it up at 3 separate family gatherings that spring, each time with the exact same phrase, "That's my boy." When I made the dean's list for the 4th consecutive semester, my father asked, genuinely, what the dean's list was. I don't say any of this looking for sympathy. I say it because I think people assume families like mine announce themselves with slammed doors and screaming matches, and mine never did. Ours was quieter than that. Ours ran on a mission. And omission, it turns out, is a wound you can carry for 9 years without anyone ever having to apologize for inflicting it, because nobody can point to the moment it happened. There wasn't one moment. There were hundreds of small ones, stacked so evenly on top of each other that the whole structure just looked, from the outside, like an ordinary family having an ordinary Sunday. I applied to law school the fall after I finished my political science degree at the University of Washington. I told my parents over that same dinner table on a Tuesday night in October, 3 weeks before my 23rd birthday. I remember the date because it was the night before my LSAT retake, and I had spent the walk over rehearsing how I'd say it so it sounded like an announcement instead of a request for permission I already knew wasn't coming. My father put his fork down. "Law school," he said, like I'd told him I was joining a cult. "You know how many lawyers are broke, right? You know that's like a fantasy career. Everybody thinks they're going to be some big-shot attorney. I'm not trying to be a big-shot attorney. I want to do transactional work. Corporate structuring." He waved a hand like I'd started speaking a language he didn't feel obligated to learn. "Nobody's saying you're not smart, sweetheart. We're just being realistic. That's 3 more years of you not making money, and for what?" My mother didn't argue with him. She never did. She just added, gently, the way you'd talk someone down from a ledge, "You've always been the careful one, Nora. Maybe something a little more, I don't know, attainable? Mitchell's manager says there's an opening in claims processing if you wanted something stable."
I did not answer either of them that night.
I finished my dinner. I drove home. I took the LSAT retake the next morning and scored a 168, 11 points higher than my first attempt, and I did not tell them the number because I already understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that it would not matter to them either way. What none of them knew, what I made a quiet, deliberate decision not to tell them, somewhere around my 2nd year of law school, was that I wasn't just attending the University of Washington School of Law on loans and a part-time research stipend. I had been selected, in the spring of my first year, for the 9th Circuit Judicial Mentorship Fellowship, an honor that took 11 students a year from 3 West Coast law schools and paired each of them with a sitting federal judge for a 2-year clerkship track apprenticeship. Mine was Judge Ilsa Rehnquist, appointed to the United States District Court for the Western District of Washington 14 years earlier, a woman known in Seattle legal circles for being exacting, unsentimental, and almost impossible to impress. I was impossible to impress too, by then. We understood each other immediately. By my 3rd year, I was clerking part-time for Judge Rehnquist's chambers and had accepted an offer, contingent on passing the bar, which I would sit for in July, from Bregman Sterling LLP, a 140-attorney corporate firm on the 31st floor of a glass tower on 5th Avenue downtown. Starting salary $178,000. With a signing bonus, my family would have needed a calculator to believe. I told no one at that dinner table. Not the fellowship. Not the clerkship. Not the offer letter sitting in a drawer in my apartment, still smelling faintly of the toner from the firm's printer the day I picked it up in person. I had learned by then that the version of me my family had already decided on didn't have room for the actual facts. So, I stopped offering them. There was a specific moment, in the spring of my 2nd year, when I understood exactly how deep that decision was going to have to go. Judge Rehnquist had asked me, almost in passing, whether my family knew about the fellowship. I told her, honestly, that they didn't. She looked at me for a long moment over the top of her reading glasses, the same look she gave associates who'd cited the wrong circuit in a brief, and said, "That's your business, Ms. Vance. But I'd think carefully about who you're protecting by staying quiet. Sometimes it isn't them." I thought about that sentence for weeks. I am still not entirely sure, even now, whether the silence protected them or protected me. Maybe it did both. Maybe that's the only honest answer there is. The escalation, when it finally came, wasn't really about me at all. It was about Mitchell, the way most things in that family eventually were. 6 weeks before graduation, my mother called to tell me Mitchell had booked a golf weekend at Chambers Bay for my father's 62nd birthday. 3 days on a course my dad had wanted to play since it hosted the U.S. Open. Tee time booked 8 months out, for guys from the dealership included. She mentioned it the way she mentioned everything with Mitchell in it, warmly, at length, with the specific pride reserved for accomplishments that required a credit card and no follow-through. I did the math out loud, gently, the way you point out something you already suspect no one will actually hear. That's the same weekend as my graduation. There was a pause on the line. Not a long one. Just long enough. "Oh, honey, is that this year? I thought you still had another semester." She said it lightly, like she was asking whether I'd renewed my gym membership. "Well, I'm sure Mitchell can move the tee time. Let me ask him." She did not ask him. I know this because 2 weeks later, when I called to confirm because some small, stubborn part of me still believed that if I just said it plainly enough, someone would hear it, my father answered instead and told me, in the tone of a man delivering minor scheduling news, that the tee time was locked in, non-refundable, and that these things happen once in a lifetime and grad school, you'll have plenty more of those. I said, "I have one graduation, Dad. I won't have plenty more of those." "Don't be dramatic," he said. "We'll take you to a nice dinner when we're back. Sunday, maybe." I did not answer. I set the phone down on the counter instead, the plastic cool against my palm, and I looked at the calendar on my refrigerator for a long moment, at the small red circle I had drawn around June 13th 4 months earlier, back when I still thought the circle would matter to somebody besides me. I did not fight them on it again. I had learned over 9 years of Sunday dinners that there is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from explaining your own significance to people who have already decided you don't have any, and somewhere in my second year of law school, under Judge Rehnquist's unimpressed, watchful eye, I had finally stopped being willing to pay that cost. Instead, I did something my family did not know I was capable of. I picked up the phone and called Judge Rehnquist's chambers. I hadn't planned to invite her. It felt, honestly, like an imposition, a sitting federal judge, giving up a Saturday morning to watch a law school commencement in a college football stadium for a clerk she'd known 2 years. But when her clerk's office called back 3 days later, it wasn't a decline. It was Judge Rehnquist herself, on the line, brisk as always. "I already told the courthouse I'll be out Saturday morning," she said, before I'd finished asking. David Okafor from Bregman Sterling asked if he could join. Said something about wanting to see his newest associate in the wild before she starts making his life difficult in depositions. A pause, dry as everything about her. "I told him it was your call, not mine." David Okafor was the managing partner of Bregman Sterling LLP. I had met him exactly twice. Once at my callback interview, once when I signed my offer letter in his corner office, 31 floors above 5th Avenue, with a view that made the whole city look like something you could hold in one hand. I said yes to both of them, without hesitating. And then, quietly, without telling a single person in my family, I arranged 3 seats in the guest section reserved for university VIPs and federal court affiliates, Section 12, Row C, seats my family, had they come, would never even have known existed, because the tickets I'd mailed them back in March were for the general lower bowl, Section 8. I did not tell my parents who was coming. I did not tell them because by that point I understood something about them that had taken me 27 years to fully accept. They were never going to show up for who I actually was. They were only ever going to show up for who I appeared to be to other people. And I had decided, somewhere between that October dinner table and this June morning, that I was done managing which version of myself they got to see. I hung up the phone that night, and I did not feel triumphant. I felt something quieter and heavier, the specific stillness of a person who has stopped waiting for a door to open and started building her own. Graduation morning, my family did not call. I told myself I hadn't expected them to, and mostly I believed it. I put on the gown alone in my apartment on Roosevelt, the one with the radiator that clanked, and I looked at myself in the mirror over the sink for a long moment. Cap slightly crooked, gold cords for the fellowship crossed over my shoulders, the reflection of a woman standing in a kitchen that smelled faintly of burnt toast and old coffee grounds, and I did not cry. I had done all my crying about this particular subject years earlier, in installments too small for anyone to notice. I drove to the stadium myself. I parked in the gravel overflow lot myself. And at 9:52 that morning, standing alone in that lot while everyone around me found their people, I called my father because some part of me, the part that is apparently never fully finished hoping, wanted to give him one more chance to prove me wrong. He did not. A golf trip sounded more fun, he said, and in the background, unmistakably, Mitchell laughed. I did not answer him for exactly 1 second. Okay, I said. I heard you. I hung up the phone. I did not call my mother. I walked into the stadium, found section 12, row C, and there they were. Judge Rehnquist in a charcoal blazer despite the June warmth, sunglasses pushed up into gray hair, and beside her David Okafor, in a suit that had clearly never seen a golf course, both of them standing to meet me before I'd even reached the row. There she is, Okafor said, and shook my hand like I was already one of his partners instead of someone who hadn't yet passed the bar. I took my seat between them. 2 hours later, when they called my name, Nora Elizabeth Vance, Juris Doctor with honors, Ninth Circuit Judicial Mentorship Fellow, and I crossed the stage, I looked up into Section 12 and saw Judge Rehnquist standing, the only person in her row on her feet, clapping in the unhurried, deliberate way of someone who does not applaud things she doesn't mean. Afterward, on the field, in the crush of gowns and confetti and parents taking photos of children who were, for once, not me, David Okafor put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Bregman Sterling is very glad to have you starting in August, Ms. Vance." And Judge Rehnquist, standing beside him, added the only compliment she'd given me in 2 years that didn't come wrapped in a critique. "You've earned every part of this. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." I asked a stranger, another graduate's aunt, kind-faced, holding a professional camera, to take one photo. Me in the center, cap tilted the way I liked it, Judge Rehnquist on my left, David Okafor on my right, Husky Stadium South stands rising gold behind us in the noon light. I posted it 40 minutes later, sitting alone on a bench outside the stadium with a granola bar I didn't want and hadn't touched. I did not write a long caption. I did not mention my father or the golf trip or the 9 years at that kitchen table. I wrote 4 words, because by then, 4 words were all I had left that I was willing to give them. With my special guests. I set the phone down on the bench beside me. I did not check it again for almost 3 hours. I found out what happened next the way I found out most things about my family, secondhand and late. My mother told me the story herself, weeks later, in a version I could tell she'd rehearsed and softened, but even softened, it was clear enough. Someone, a cousin, then an aunt, then half the group text my mother kept with her sisters, had recognized the woman standing on my left. Judge Ilsa Rehnquist wasn't famous, exactly, but she'd presided over a case 18 months earlier involving a local shipping company that had made the front page of the Seattle Times for 6 straight days, and her photo had run beside the headline. Someone in my mother's book club had clerked for the county court years ago and knew the name Bregman Sterling on site. It was the firm that had represented the winning side in a zoning dispute that had personally cost my mother's own neighbor 11 months and a great deal of money. My mother read the caption. My mother looked at the photo for what she later admitted was a long time. And my mother, at 2:40 that afternoon, showed the photo to my father, who was 3 drinks into the clubhouse bar at Chambers Bay. With Mitchell and 2 men from the dealership, still in his golf shoes, still telling the story about how his daughter's little school thing had gotten rescheduled in his head to something he could safely skip. He did not finish his drink. My mother told me later that he went pale reading it, pale in the specific way of a man doing fast, unwelcome arithmetic about who exactly he had just made a joke about, out loud, on a phone call his other son had laughed through. They left the golf course within the hour. It is a 2-hour drive from University Place to the University District in Saturday traffic, and my mother told me, in the same rehearsed, softened voice, that my father did not say much during it. By the time they reached Husky Stadium, the ceremony had ended 2 hours earlier. The graduates were long gone. The chairs were being folded on the field by a maintenance crew in orange vests. There was nothing left for them to arrive at, no gown to see, no name to hear called, no stage to watch me cross. Only an empty stadium, a parking lot half full of other families' cars, and my mother, standing beside my father in the spot where the guest sections had been, both of them, by her own account, pale-faced and too late for something that had already, quietly, finished without them. I was not there to see it, but I heard about it in 3 separate pieces over the following weeks, and each piece landed the way the last handful of dominoes in a long line do, smaller than the first fall, but unmistakably still falling. The first piece came from Mitchell himself, 3 days later, in a text I did not answer for 2 full days. *K. Didn't realize the whole judge thing. That's actually really impressive. Sorry I laughed on the call. That was a dick move. It was the closest thing to an apology Mitchell had ever offered me in 29 years, and I noticed, reading it, that he still didn't say the words, "I'm sorry," directly. Only that was a dick move, a sentence about his behavior instead of about me. I texted back 1 word. Noted. I did not elaborate. The second piece came from my mother's sister, my Aunt Colleen, who called me the following Sunday to say that my mother hadn't left the house in 2 days after Chambers Bay, mortified at having told the entire book club in advance that I was still figuring things out. Aunt Colleen had always been the one relative who asked what I was studying and actually waited for the answer. "She's not upset at you," Colleen told me. "She's upset at herself for finding out from a Facebook comment instead of from you." I let that sit for a moment before I answered. "She could have found out from me any time in the last 9 years, I said. "She just never asked." The third piece came from my father directly, a week after that, at a dinner I did eventually agree to attend, the first Sunday dinner in 9 years where I sat down at that table and nobody asked me what I was up to, because for the first time, everyone in the room already knew, in exhausting, photographed, front-page adjacent detail, exactly what I had been up to the entire time. He tried, clumsily, to bring up the golf trip as a joke. "Guess I picked the wrong weekend, huh?" And the table went silent in a way it never had for me, waiting to see what I would do with it. I set down my fork. I did not raise my voice. "You didn't pick the wrong weekend, Dad. You picked golf. Every time for 9 years, when it came down to me or something easier, you picked the easier thing. The weekend just happened to be the one where somebody else finally noticed." Nobody at that table said anything for a long moment. I picked my fork back up and kept eating, because I had learned, a long time ago, that the silence after a true sentence doesn't need my help to finish landing. My father called me that night. I let it ring 4 times before I answered, not out of cruelty, but because I genuinely wasn't certain until I picked up, whether I wanted to. "Nora." His voice was different than it had been that morning. No wind behind it now, no metallic ping of a club connecting with a ball. Just quiet, and something underneath the quiet I didn't immediately recognize, because I had so rarely heard it from him. That judge. And the lawyer. From the firm. "Judge Rehnquist," I said. "And David Okafor. He's the managing partner. I start there in August." There was a long pause. I did not fill it. "I didn't know," he said finally. "I know you didn't," I said. "I never told you. I stopped telling you things a long time ago, Dad." Another pause, longer this time. I could hear him breathing, and somewhere behind him, my mother, saying something I couldn't make out. "We should have been there," he said. "You should have," I agreed. Not because of who was in the photo, because it was my graduation. I paused, and I found, to my own quiet surprise, that my voice did not shake. "You didn't know what I'd built. That's not really the problem, Dad. The problem is you never asked." He didn't have an answer for that. I hadn't expected one. "I'll think about coming to the dinner Sunday," I told him, which was the closest thing to an opening I was willing to offer that night, and I meant it exactly as much as it sounded, as a door left slightly ajar, not thrown wide open. I hung up the phone. I did not cry then either. I made tea instead, and stood at my kitchen window looking out at the wet Seattle street below, and let the stillness sit with me for a while before I did anything else with it. I want to tell you something, and I want you to actually hear it because I spent 9 years not being heard, and I know the difference now between a room that's listening and a room that's just waiting for its turn to talk. Setting a boundary is not cruelty. It never was. When I stopped explaining myself to people who had already decided the explanation didn't matter, I wasn't punishing anyone. I was simply telling the truth about where my energy was allowed to go from that point forward. You can love people who dismissed you, genuinely love them, the complicated, imperfect kind of love that doesn't erase the years, and still refuse to keep shrinking yourself back down to the size they find comfortable. Love was never supposed to be a blank check written against your own worth. The people who show up for you before you've proven anything, a mentor who gives up her Saturday, a stranger with a camera, a colleague who calls you our newest associate before you've billed a single hour, those people are choosing you in a way that biology never requires anyone to do. Family is a fact you're born into. Belonging is a decision people make about you, over and over, on ordinary days when nothing is forcing their hand. Walking away from a table that has never once made room for the truth about you is not bitterness. It is the only reasonable thing to do with your one life. You cannot grow into your full size in a room built around the smallest possible version of you. And the quiet that comes after. The version of a Sunday where no one is measuring you against your brother, where no one is deciding your worth before you've finished a sentence. That silence isn't empty. That's what peace actually sounds like.
I hadn't heard it before that June.
I have heard it almost every day since. My father did not become a different man overnight. We are still, 9 months later, figuring out what a relationship looks like when it's built on the truth instead of the convenient parts of it. But he came to my bar exam results dinner in October. He asked, unprompted, what transactional work actually meant, and he listened to the answer all the way through without checking his phone once, which was new enough that I noticed it and did not say so out loud. He is, slowly, learning to ask the question instead of assuming he already knows the answer. Mitchell and I are still working out what we are to each other. We talk more than we used to, mostly about ordinary things, his kids, my ridiculous hours at the firm, a Mariners game neither of us can afford good seats to. He has never again laughed at something that mattered to me, not once, in 9 months. I don't know if that's growth or just caution. I've decided it doesn't matter which. The behavior changed. That's the part one get to keep. My mother never fully explained why she didn't correct him at the kitchen table 9 years ago, or why she waited for a photograph to tell her who her own daughter had become. I don't think she has an explanation. I think sometimes people just stop looking, and it takes something loud enough to make them look again. He said a golf trip sounded more fun because he genuinely believed, in that moment, that nothing about my life could possibly outrank 18 holes at a course he'd wanted to play for years. He never imagined that the thing he skipped would turn out to be the moment he'd spend the rest of the year explaining to relatives at every holiday that followed. So let me ask you the same thing I've had to sit with myself. If you had been standing in that gravel lot, phone against your ear, hearing your own father laugh at a golf trip, would you have kept calling, the way I did for 9 years? Or would you have stopped a lot sooner than I did? I don't think there's a wrong answer. I just think, whichever one you picked, it's worth knowing why. I still have the photo from that day, printed and framed now, sitting on the bookshelf in my office on the 31st floor, Judge Rehnquist on my left, David Okafor on my right, Husky Stadium gold behind us in the noon light. I didn't hang it up to prove anything to anyone. I hung it up because it's the day I stopped waiting for the right people to show up and started noticing the ones who already had. The story you just heard was inspired by real experiences shared on public platforms including Reddit and other online communities. It has been thoughtfully adapted and reimagined for storytelling purposes. All characters, situations, names, and settings are fictional, altered, or generated using AI tools. Any resemblance to real individuals or events is entirely coincidental and unintentional. This story was created to deliver positive messages, emotional insight, and meaningful reflection, not to represent or defame any real person or situation.